So let's go ahead and keep this one being on the draw. So the natural obsolescence is a one-of in the deck, but most decks have artifacts. There's some that this card is better against than others. So that's one of the wonky one-ofs, but it's at its best against smarter vehicles. Clearly we're not up against smarter vehicles here, as our opponent's just leading on a forest. Looks like they are a little bit mana screwed though. So that's we're going to be able to anticipate and set up. So missed a land drop for a turn, but here's Winding Constrictor. So it looks like black-green. So we can take this Incendiary Flow and try to get the Constrictor off the table. So I like that idea. And there's an Attune with Aether. So we have the energy from the Aether Hub to be able to cast the Attune. So this is a pretty reasonable turn. Incendiary Flow, take out Constrictor, Attune, get a Forest. And so now we're set up for next turn, but we're a little bit vulnerable. Like if our opponent drops something like a Rishkar or what have you, creatures, we're not going to be able, even a Nissa would be, there's a bunch of cards that are going to be bad for us because we don't have immediate removal for them. So we're going to have to use time and our life total to get us back in the game. We're lucky our opponent missed that land drop early on because we've got a little bit more time to set up. But you know what? This is bad for us. So our opponent's going to attempt to drop a Rishkar. Got a couple of options here. So we can Glimmer of Genius. And that's going to mean this Rishkar definitely comes into play. We can also, I'll anticipate, try to find either another Harness Lightning or a Horribly Awry. So I like casting the Anticipate, looking for either a Harness Lightning or a Horribly Awry. So we found a Harness Lightning, which is what we were looking for. So now we can either, well, we have a choice. We can either get rid of the Constrictor or the Rishkar with the Harness Lightning. But I think the Constrictor is the more pressing problem. So I'm going to take that out, even though the Rishkar being able to produce mana is definitely a little bit scary because of the acceleration into something like a Gearhulk, but we have natural obsolescence in hand. So we can use that to answer something like a Birders Gearhulk. So I liked how that turn played out for us. Being able to anticipate for the Harness Lightning was clutch. Is this something like a Gonti or a Walking Ballista maybe? Okay, so it's a Ballista. But that's going to mean we're not taking any damage. We're still at 20, which is perfect. And now we can go ahead and use this Glimmer. So we're not looking for lands at this point. Think we want another Glimmer, and so now we're just kind of flush with action, and I would be very surprised if our opponent found a way to win the game here, to be honest with you, because look at all this gas. Like, these Gearhulks are just, we can get back whatever we want from our graveyard with them. And our opponent is going to make an attack, so I think this is Gearhulk time. And even if our opponent does have something like maybe a Blossoming Defense, maybe a Murder, I think that means we want to just get the Harness Lightning out of our graveyard, take one of these creatures off the board, and then attempt to make blocks on the other one. So I'm going to go ahead, Harness Lightning the Rishkar, and see how our opponent reacts to this. Looks like that is going to work out. And so if we're allowed to block the Ballista, now maybe our opponent even has a Grasp of Darkness. And you know what? Fine. You know, if that's what's going to happen, then great. Otherwise, our opponent's just cashing in Walking Ballista to deal us 2 damage, even better. And looks like maybe a follow-up. Well, we'll see what the follow-up is, but either way, we're just in a great spot. And so we see, even in the black-green matchup, we haven't cast the Natural Obsolescence, but having it in hand just in case of that Bird or Gearhulk is really nice. But that Ruinous Path, the Gearhulk basically was a 3-for-1. Got rid of our opponent's entire board, and we really don't care much at all about that Ruinous Path, to be honest with you. I'm just going to confirm suspicions, this Mind Rack Demon, which is going to really put the game out of reach because we can just start cracking these clues. We can even go Torrential Gearhulk plus confirm suspicions, which is one of my favorite plays the deck is able to make. And we haven't needed Dynavolt Tower this game, even though we saw one we could have taken off and anticipate. Just haven't needed it. I'm going to take the 2 damage from the Quagmire. Not really concerned with that. And end of turn, let's go ahead and go for another Gearhulk to try to close the game out with. And we can just draw 1,000,000 cards, essentially. So it looks like our opponent knows what was going on. Pretty much no chance for our opponent to win that game at that point. So we're playing against black-green. We haven't seen energy cards. We didn't see Aether Hub. We didn't see Siphoners or Greenbelt Rampagers or Long Tusk Cubs. So we're assuming our opponent isn't on that version of the black-green deck. And so we're going to board accordingly. So a card like Shock is just not as strong of a card against a deck that doesn't have 2 toughness creatures. We didn't see 2 toughness creatures besides, being able to kill a Rishkar with the trigger on the stack. We don't have that much in our sideboard that we want for the matchup, so the negates, I like shaving on them. Sometimes your opponent does have Nissa, which is definitely a card you would want to negate. We want the Confiscation Coup for sure. It's one of the best cards in this matchup. The Natural Obsolescence gets rid of Ballista, and it gets rid of Gearhulk. So I'm actually fine with boarding 1 copy in, which may seem a little bit counterintuitive. And then the Shielded Aether Thieves are fine, but I'm not going to board them in here. I think we just want to keep our deck pretty straightforward. Lots of counters, lots of card advantage with card draw, etc. And I'm going to take out 1 of the Shocks. And that's going to be it. Not going to do a whole lot for this matchup. It's not that the matchup is actually that great. It's just more of a matter of how our opponent starts off the game. Like if they go Constrictor, into Rishkar, and we don't have the immediate removal, then once the creatures get to 4 toughness, 5 toughness, then it's a lot harder to work with the Dynavolt Towers to get rid of your opponent's threats. So if we're given the opportunity, we will make the most of it. But it looks like it is the slower Delirium version that we're up against. We saw Mind Rack Demon, now we're seeing Traverse the Ulvenwald. So that adds up. This time around, I am going to attune right away rather than wait, because we don't have a lot of lands in hand. So I would like to attune right now, rather than trying to get the tower out and then attuning after that. But it looks like, okay, our opponent's just passing. So maybe our opponent does have a card like Grim Player and Sylvan Advocate and Constrictor and all those potential 2-drops. There's a lot of 2-drops our opponent could have, but you know what? They're not in our opponent's hand, so that's good for us. Now we'll see, is this going to be a Planeswalker maybe? No? Okay, it's a Tireless Tracker. So this is where things get murky because Tireless Tracker is not an easy card to deal with. I am going to play out my Dynavolt Tower here. And so the hope is, first of all, our opponent doesn't have a big play on their turn. Okay? Second of all, if we draw a land and are able to Glimmer, we can immediately get a bunch of energy and then use the tower to get rid of the tracker. Now, our opponent's able to follow up with the land. These trackers are really going to be annoying. So, in comes a tracker. As expected, we drew a Harness Lightning, so that's actually a good draw. We can Harness Lightning away a tracker and then tower away another one. So we're able to get rid of these trackers. Although we're down to 0 energy, we're kind of forced to make the play. So once again, are able to get rid of trackers, but we're kind of leaving ourselves open. If our opponent makes a big play here, it's going to be really bad. Gonti is bad for us. No question about that, but it's not the worst card we could be facing down against. It's kind of just depends what our opponent found off the Gonti, but our mana's not cooperating at all. So this looks like we may just lose the game due to mana problems. Even though we were able to attune earlier, just a handful of cards we can't cast and negate at this point. We don't even have an energy to be able to play Disallow or Void Shatter, which is really frustrating. Just really frustrating. And here's a Rishkar, and there's not really coming back from this. So let's go to the next game. Really unfortunate draws there. Hopefully we got mana screwed there. Our opponent got a little bit mana screwed the first game. So hopefully we have a good deciding game. And we get to consider our options on the play. And I think just taking out the negates makes sense. We saw Traverses. We haven't seen Planeswalkers. Plus, on the play, we can counter Disallow. We can counter cards like Liliana and Nissa with Disallow and Void Shatter. So, taking out the negates, I think we probably just want a Shock, and Aether Thief is fine as well. The Shocks, we can use them to get rid of trackers, that kind of thing. So they're not amazing, but even a card like Walking Ballista, we can shock it. So hopefully we'll get a good 6-card hand. Didn't have a playable 7. And yeah, this is perfectly fine. So I'm gonna keep that Disallow on top, and we're gonna be finding ourselves in a position where we're gonna be able to counter. We're gonna have the option to counter our opponent's first couple plays, most likely. So that's not a bad place. Not a bad place to be. So we have this Horribly Awry. And it looks like we're going to want to use it. Rather than try to Incendiary Flow this, I am going to counter it. We can use the flow later. And we haven't seen Planeswalkers like Liliana or Nissa, but That doesn't mean our opponent doesn't have them. We still have to be scared of those cards, because if we say just untap, go Incendiary Flow your Grim player, and then our opponent drops, you know, something like a Planeswalker, it's going to be really bad. Now, this Scrap Heap Scrounger, I think we want to just let it resolve. Because we have the flow to be able to deal with it. We're going to be able to anticipate now. And interesting, lots of options. I think we want the Void Shatter, and just to try to hide behind these counterspells. Now there's a land, which was a nice draw. Untapped land. So we're going to be able to Glimmer end of turn if our opponent elects not to play something to try to keep the pressure going. So this is kind of the best of both worlds. We've got our card draw and our counterspell. So we can afford to not immediately Incendiary Flow with the Scrap Heap Scrounger. We'll have an opportunity to do that if we want to. So this Tireless Tracker, I think we want to just say no to. Don't want to let it resolve. Then our opponent maybe plays a land, gets a clue, and we're just going to stop that before it starts. And so, yeah, our opponent actually did have the land to follow up there. So I'm gonna Incendiary Flow away the Scrounger now. And we have Void Shatter, so our opponent's pretty likely to play something here, not 100%, but we can Void Shatter our opponent's play, and then we're just kind of in top deck mode. So we can Void Shatter the Mind Rack Demon. We have a Glimmer in hand, so hopefully that can help us gas back up. So I'm just going to play the Botanical Sanctum and pass. And the reason why I'm just passing is there's some value here to representing a counterspell. Even though we don't have it, maybe our opponent, gives us credit for our last card being a counterspell. So just going to pass the turn. But it's likely our opponent just plays whatever threat they have, so there's the Winding Constrictor. But you know what? Looks like just a passing of the turn, so that could have been way worse than it was. Now we can go ahead and Glimmer. Definitely want the Disallow. So we're still worried about cards like Verdurous Gearhulk, but that was a great draw. So we found Torrential Gearhulk, and that's going to be a way to take over the game potentially, depending on what our opponent is able to do here. So this is a pretty key turn. And our opponent's going to actually go for an activation of Hissing Quagmire. So this is great. We can just go ahead and we're going to get to block with our Gearhulk on the Winding Constrictor and to just munch on it while also getting to Glimmer of Genius. So I think this is basically a game-winning sequence. And 2 spells on top. At this point, we just want spells. We don't want lands. So Confiscation Coup is also happens to be really good. The Aether Thief, it's on this board pretty marginal, but you know what? We'll take it anyways. We got 5 energy, so you know what? Maybe I take that back, because even though the blocking part of it isn't good, we can use it to draw some cards, and our opponent's in a really rough situation. So just picked up the Attune. No reason not to play it. Just to hit land drops. And that's going to be